This episode is brought to you by Roundtable Group, the experts on experts. We've been connecting attorneys with experts for over 25 years. Find out more at roundtablegroup.com.
Welcome to Discussions at the Roundtable. I'm Noah Ballmer, your host, and today I am excited to speak with Dr. Roger Launius. Now, Dr. Launius is an accomplished historian and principal at Launius Historical Services. He's authored several books on aerospace history and NASA programs, for which he has won the American Institute of Aeronautics and Astronautics History Manuscript Prize. Additionally, he has published award-winning books on historical figures ranging from Joseph Smith to Charlie Finley. Dr. Launius holds a Ph.D. in history from Louisiana State University at Baton Rouge and is a fellow at multiple organizations, including the American Association for the Advancement of Science and the Royal Aeronautical Society, among many others. Dr. Launius, it is an absolute privilege to have you on the show.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
Let's just jump right into it. You've made a career in history, and in particular, the history of NASA, for which you have a new book coming out, and aerospace. Have you always been drawn to the space program? How did you get started?
Well, I mean, I was a fan when I was a kid, but that was, as a 10-year-old watching rockets go up. What could be more fun? That's sort of my background. It went away for a while. I didn't really focus on that when I was doing my educational activities, and but I came back to it when I took a job working for the U.S. Air Force after I finished my Ph.D. and the Air Force was a place where I learned that flying was a very cool thing to sort of write the history of, in addition to sort of watching it from afar. And sure. Ultimately, I moved to NASA as the chief historian and spent 12 years at the NASA headquarters in that particular function. And then for the last 15 years of my career, before I retired, I was the associate director for Collections and Curatorial Affairs at the National Air and Space Museum at the Smithsonian Institute. So during that 35-year career, I focused on aerospace, and that's what I'm doing in my retirement phase today, and what we're talking about in this context.
Sure, that is a significant amount of experience. How did that become? How did you parlay that into becoming an expert witness? Did you actively seek this, or did it just kind of fall on you?
I didn't actively seek this particular type of activity. While I had worked for the federal government, I had been involved in a couple of different court cases, and always on behalf of the U.S. government in those particular settings. And often that was preparing background materials, historical documentation, things of that nature. In a couple of cases, I ended up testifying at those particular trials, but it was not a major feature of what I was doing. Since I retired, I've been involved in, and not very many, but a couple of cases since that time as an expert witness. And I'm still very much a novice when it comes to this, although I do have a strong background in aerospace history. And so if there is the need for that kind of information that is brought to bear on a particular case, I'm a person that they can call upon, and they've done so on a few occasions.
When you talk about background material, what does that involve?
It's mostly research and the preparation of briefs that are helpful to the lawyers who are arguing the case. I have a very strong knowledge of federal government documents and where they're located and how to get to them. I will say immediately that this is not classified material at all. That's been much in the news, and that's not what we're talking about here. But the result of that has been my expertise here is to bring to bear that kind of documentation to whatever the subject happens to be that's being litigated.
So when you first interface with an attorney, they tell you, hey, we've got this kind of a case and we need this kind of information about it. When you talk about doing research to to prepare them for the case. What sort of research are you doing that's outside? So are you simply taking the expertise that you already have and putting it on paper, or do you have to actively research the specifics to what they're looking for?
It's a little of both. Obviously, there may be generic things that they need that will help them make their case. And it may be as simple as they need a timeline of activities at a particular location that's a part of NASA or a part of the DoD or at one of the contractors someplace. And I can build that for them. I can help them put that material together that will give them a sense of what has taken place there. And if it's a case that deals with say asbestos poisoning or something like that, there's always a history to, well, everything has a history, and right. I can help uncover that history. And my particular expertise in this is I know where a lot of the documentation is.
When you're preparing for a case and an attorney is specifically preparing you for a case, that especially the ones that you've actually shown up at and that have gone to trial, what works for you and what doesn't work for you in terms of prep?
Well, the initial part of this obviously is putting together the materials necessary to make whatever testimony I would need to make, and sure. And that. I err on the side of extreme preparedness and exhaustive research along those lines. And that's probably to the good. There may be folks who have a different approach, but I always feel it's better to be over-prepared than under-prepared. Again, my first step is almost always to build some sort of a timeline, a chronology of what happened, when it happened, and how it happened. And that's just the bare bones of a history, obviously. And then there's larger questions associated with why and so forth along those particular lines. But sure. If the piece of the case that I'm involved in, and I'm only involved in the history pieces of this, I can't make arguments about other things other than the historical background to something.
Sure. And when you're there in court and you're facing cross, have you felt well prepared? Is it just a matter of knowing your material and just answering honestly, or has there been any other kinds of strategies you've had to employ for when you're being grilled by the other side?
I wish I had a good strategy. Preparation is the fundamental piece of this. If you don't know the answer to a question, you simply say that. If I did not prepare and have the background to argue something, I don't say it in court. That's for darn sure. And of course, obviously, the lawyers who are arguing the case will go through the prep work with you to tell you where you're maybe light or heavy in your analysis and what you should say and shouldn't say, with the intent of fully covering everything, but not offering more than you probably should.
While I understand that there's definitely things that you can and can't talk about in your line of work, do you have any interesting cases that you can tell us about? Any cases that you've served as an expert in that you can give us, kind of an overview of how it went down?
Oh, sure. There was a case not very long ago that the company was was engaged in a lawsuit that was about toxic chemicals that were available there and had somehow presumably caused damage. Now, I can't speak to the toxicity of any substance. I can't talk about what was there or not there in that context. What I can do is talk about how, and what I did was prepare briefs that explained how the contractor process worked for the federal government in this particular project, and can say what was acceptable, what was not acceptable, where the safeguards were that were in place to ensure that that exposure to these toxic chemicals was not a problem. And so I go through the paperwork associated with this and look at that. There is, and that goes a long way toward answering the question and what I can give them. The next question would be, which I can't answer, is did they violate those rules? I can't tell you the answer to that because I do not know. Only witnesses to that particular part of it could say something about it. But my piece of this was to establish here were the policies and procedures that were in place and what was taking place in the context of the overall project.
Now that brings up an interesting point, the boundaries, the I don't knows, and the, that's not part of what I'm here for. And I think that that's important for experts to understand, right, is for, knowing what exactly it is that you are there to do and kind of not trying to exceed it too much, because opposing counsel will try and get you to talk about things that you're not an expert on, right?
Right. Yeah.
And
you have to be cautious in those settings and not overstep, not outrun your documentation and your data.
Right. So how do you stay, an expert in your field? This is, obviously history is history. It's already written, but there's a lot of it and it's always unfolding. I know that might sound obvious, but when you're brought on to talk about the history of something as broad as, NASA or the Department of Justice or asbestos or whatever it is that you're working on at the time, how do you maintain that expertise?
Well, obviously, I've spent a lifetime sort of bringing myself up to speed on all aspects of spaceflight history. There are many things, obviously, I do not know. And the details of how, of the procedures that were in place, say, for instance, with toxic chemicals, and how they tried to protect against those, were not something I'd studied previously. But you can go back into the record and find the materials that where the procedures and the policies were put into place, the written record associated with that. And I can certainly do that and talk about that in that context. But to say much beyond that, I can't. Other people with other knowledge have to speak to those kinds of issues.
Is there anything that you felt, as a newer expert witness, you haven't done this too many times. Is there anything that you have felt that you have not been, adequately prepared for that you would like attorneys to know? Is there anything that you feel that could be done better? That's, as a newer person who's kind of not exactly sure what you're getting yourself into every single time?
I'm sure there is. The few times that I've done this, I tended, in my initial reports, I tended to err on the side of inclusion and put more stuff in than the attorneys were necessarily seeking. And I've been pulled back a couple of times in that setting. Okay, we want to establish this, whatever this is, in terms of the story, but we don't want you to go down rabbit holes and open up things that now become a part of the written record and the process that'll be litigated if it doesn't serve a purpose from their perspective. And so I'd like to know that up front. Unfortunately, most attorneys don't know the answer to that either until they start to see what the papers say when you find that. Find out what you're offering to them. So there's an iterative process in terms of preparation of these documents. At least it is for me, and they're all working papers, so they're confidential materials.
Before we wrap up, I'd like to ask you about any time management skills that you may have. How do you manage everything? Do you use calendaring, or do you just try and keep it going? What's your strategy for time management?
Yeah, I wish I had a good answer for that. That's everybody's problem, isn't it?
Right.
I've seen it with students. I've seen it with attorneys. I've seen it with myself. I've seen it with everybody I can think of. There's never enough time in the day to do the things that you really probably should be doing. So my approach is to sort of, in the mornings, I tend to work on these things when I first get up, and I'm an early riser. So that's usually what I do, in that by noon or so, I probably wiped on most of the things I need to do, and don't want to go back to it unless there's a hard deadline that I need to meet, and then go off and do other things for the afternoon. But that's just my approach. Other people can do whatever they are comfortable with.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Launius, for joining me today. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you. Take care.
This is Noah Ballmer, and I'll see you next time for another discussion at the Roundtable.
Thank you for listening to our podcast, Discussions at Roundtable. Our show notes are available on our website, roundtablegroup.com. Subscribe today on Apple Podcasts or your favorite listening apps.